Today we will be starting our discussion about the settling of what is now Western Canada. When discussing the European settlement in the west of Canada, one must first look at the exploration of the West by Europeans, and specifically at the opening of the West via the fur trade. From this video today, we will strive to understand the following. We will look at how the fur trade brought the Europeans into present-day Western Canada. We'll compare the different ways that the two major fur trading companies of the time operated, and we'll explore early contact and relationships between First Nations peoples of Western Canada and Europeans. Let's start the video by understanding some fairly simple abbreviations. There were two major fur trading companies. The first was the Hudson's Bay Company, or the HBC. The other was the Northwest Company, or the NWC. These names and their abbreviations became synonymous with the fur trade. Knowing the names, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, also explains the initial geographic territories in which they operated. The exports of the furs from North America to Europe started a long time ago, with both English and French fur traders penetrating into the heart of modern-day Canada. In 1670, an English company, the Hudson's Bay Company, also known as the HBC, was granted a huge chunk of land by the English king. This land was known as Rupert's Land. Within Rupert's Land, the HBC set up major trading forts along the shores of Hudson's Bay, as seen here in James Bay and along the edge of Hudson's Bay itself. The way they set these up was at the mouth of major rivers, and this policy was known as the Stay by the Bay policy. The expectation was that native traders would bring their fur by canoe from the interior down the rivers and to the forts located on the shores of Hudson Bay. They would then load these from canoes onto larger boats, which would then head to England. The British set a specific trading value for the furs, which you can see here is set up in a ledger. Now this ledger is not very clear, but you could see in places like here it says squirrels. Here it says deer, buck, doe, etc. So in this ledger, they would show trading values and they would show the amount that goes into the loads. Meanwhile, the fur trade was also being set up out of New France, and by the time the English took over New France in the mid-1700s, the fur trade was well established. In the late 1700s, English businessmen had taken over the fur trade and centered themselves in Montreal. They formed the Northwest Company, as previously mentioned, also known as the NWC, a direct rival to the Hudson's Bay Company. They set up their trading network very differently to the HBC, accessing what are now the Prairie Provinces via the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes system. Their network reached beyond Rupert's Land and into what was then called the Northwest Territories. They set up trading posts on major inland rivers. This meant that the First Nations trappers no longer had to take their furs long distances to trade with the Hudson's Bay Company. The NWC would also barter to establish a fair trading price on furs, and therefore they could undercut the deals set up between the HBC and their traditional trading partners by essentially bartering to give them more than the HBC would. With these differences in approach, a great competition for furs began. There were other major differences between the two companies as well. These are highlighted on the chart on page 128 in your text and should probably be noted. Probably the most important of these differences was the ways the company related to their employees and to the First Nations groups they traded with. The HBC employed people from Britain. These people earned a salary and were taken to Rupert's Land only for the trading season and then brought back to Britain for the winter months. The NWC, on the other hand, hired the local French population in Lower Canada to both transport the goods long distances and to run the forts in the wilderness. Those transferring the goods were known as voyageurs, as they moved or were on voyages to transport supplies and fur from place to place. Those who ran the forts for the NWC were hivernants, which translates to the English word winterers. Unlike the HBC employees, the hivernants took a share of the profits. If they had a good year of trading, they made more money. Also, unlike the HBC employees, the hivernants lived in the Northwest Territory year-round. With both of these differences, the hivernants and the NWC developed very different relationships with the First Nations peoples in the Northwest. Being in the Northwest year-round meant the hivernants were able to build stronger relationships with local tribes. In fact, often the hivernants, those winterers, the people in charge of the forts, would learn the language and the culture of the local people, and even marry into local tribes. These family connections not only made winters in the wilderness a lot more comfortable, as the traders would then have a wife and family to spend the winters with, it also meant that trading relations with the locals were stronger. More businesses from these family ties meant more profits for the hivernants, and therefore the hivernant, the trader, would not only be happier, he'd also be wealthier. From these relationships, the Métis people were born. The Métis people are those of mixed First Nations and European descent, most of those Europeans being French-Canadian in origin. The competition that the NWC brought to the fur trading industry in the Northwest meant a huge loss of business for the Hudson's Bay Company. To stay competitive, the HBC saw that they must change their business model, and that they did, eventually expanding their network of fur trading posts into the interior and looking to build stronger relationships with the First Nations peoples. This competition for profit meant that the two companies were coming into much closer contact with each other in the wilderness. Eventually, this competition would spill over into conflict. But that story is for another day. Thanks for listening.